Hey there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stronger with Time. I'm your host, Tony Battaji. In today's conversation, I sat down with Professor Michael Holick. Dr. Holick is widely regarded as the foremost authority on vitamin D, having studied it for 60 years, producing more than 600 scientific research papers, over 200 reviews and book chapters, and multiple textbooks. He was the first person to identify the circulating form of vitamin D in our blood, developing the blood test, but also the synthetic form of vitamin D that we all take to increase our vitamin D status. He sat on all editorial boards for journals studying vitamin D and has chaired the Endocrine Society position stand for vitamin D status. In today's conversation, it really was a masterclass from the living legend on vitamin D. We talked about sensible sun exposure, the difference between taking supplemental vitamin D and getting it from sunlight, what happens to our health when we go from inadequate levels to being replete, and what replete really does mean. We also finished the conversation with a timely but also controversial area of megadosing vitamin D for autoimmune disorders. Please enjoy this conversation with the world's foremost authority on vitamin D, Professor Michael Holick. Welcome, Professor Michael Holick.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Vitamin D is what we're going to talk about today, and it has been described as the closest thing we have to a panacea, while at the same time derided by many without having any excitement at all. We should stop testing. There shouldn't be reference ranges. And it leaves us, the public, really confused with what we should make of the whole vitamin D supplements, sunlight for our health. I thought we could have you today as the godfather of vitamin D research and knowledge to explain to us the benefits of vitamin D, where we should have enthusiasm and where perhaps we might have some caution. So thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
I think most people are aware of vitamin D for bone and rickets, but vitamin D has other benefits. Could you talk to us about what vitamin D is doing for our health?
Sure. So just to give you some perspective, what's really interesting to me is that the major source of vitamin D for humans on this planet has been exposure to sunlight. And it's curious that throughout evolution, there are very few foods that contain vitamin D. And I think that Mother Nature realized that the one way to guarantee vitamin D sufficiency is our hunter-gatherers being exposed to sunlight every day. And as a result, the body has adapted to that. And as also, there is essentially no vitamin D in your diet, which is why more than 50% of the world's population is vitamin D deficient or insufficient. And just to give you a couple of examples. So wild-caught salmon and oily fish contain vitamin D, about 500 to 1,000 units in a serving. We think that adults need 1,500 to 2,000 units a day. So it's obvious you're not going to be able to get enough. Some dairy products contain vitamin D in the United States, in Canada, I think in Australia. It's usually 100 units in a serving. In Australia, curiously, I think that they still do it, is we had demonstrated many years ago that mushrooms exposed to UV radiation make vitamin D. Mushrooms are a superb source, sun-dried mushrooms. And so in Australia, I'm told that like 20% of the mushrooms that are sold in produce section actually contain vitamin D. They specifically state it. But it's not that mushrooms contain it. It's only when they're exposed to ultraviolet radiation, which is what they do. So with that introduction, right, is that essentially every tissue and cell in your body has a vitamin D receptor. And we know that once you make vitamin D in your skin, it goes to your liver to get converted to 25-hydroxyvitamin D. It's the major circulating form of vitamin D that when you go to your doctor is what the doctor orders. And then it goes to your kidneys to get activated. And it's that activated form that then goes to your intestine and tells your intestine to increase efficiency of calcium absorption from your diet. And if you're not getting enough calcium from your diet, it will go to your skeleton, believe it or not to improve it, but actually to steal calcium out of it. The major function of vitamin D is to maintain your blood calcium in a normal range, because neurological function, muscular function, most metabolic functions in the body tightly regulated by your blood calcium. And so, very important. But we also know that every tissue in your body has a receptor, including, for example, the skin. Well, the skin, the colon, the breast, brain, they don't have anything to do with calcium metabolism. And so back in the 90s, we began to delve more in depth to understand this. I had already known back in 1980s that not only when you're exposed to sunlight do you make vitamin D, but that your epidermal cells have a vitamin D receptor. And so I decided to take active vitamin D, which I chemically make in a laboratory, added it to growing epidermal skin cells, and it decreased their growth and induced them to become mature. And so I decided, wouldn't that be interesting? Is there a skin disease that is hyperproliferative but not malignant? And the answer is psoriasis. About 2 to 3% of the world's population has psoriasis. And I started a study where I took the active form of vitamin D. I'm not a pharmacologist or pharmacist, but I dumped it in some Vaseline that I warmed up, got FDA approval, and initiated a clinical trial and demonstrated it worked. And so active vitamin D compounds actually is first-line therapy in patients with mild psoriasis, like on their elbows and knees. Why is that important? Because it's giving us an insight into other biologic functions of vitamin D. And even in the early 1980s, it was beginning to be appreciated that cancer cells, if they had a vitamin D receptor and you incubated them with active vitamin D, they became more normal. And so a lot of work went into asking the question, is vitamin D deficiency associated with increased risk for, say, colon cancer? And the Garland brothers, back in the early 90s, they had done a study, a prospective study in Baltimore, Maryland, and they looked at circulating concentrations of 25-hydroxyvitamin D and then followed them for 8 years. And they reported that those that had the highest concentrations had a marked reduced risk of getting colorectal cancer. And so that was kind of the introduction into the concept that maybe vitamin D has other biologic functions. We also know that if you live at higher latitudes, so for example, if you live above about 34 degrees north latitude, you have 100% increased risk of developing multiple sclerosis if you live there for the first 10 years of your life. And once you move, say from Atlanta, Georgia, up here to Boston, it doesn't matter, right? You still had reduced risk, 50% reduced risk of getting multiple sclerosis. Sun exposure and improvement in your vitamin D status has been related to reduced risk of autoimmune disorders, cardiovascular disease, neurocognitive dysfunction, as well as infectious diseases. I mean, Vincent got the Nobel Prize back in 2000 in the early 1900s because he was exposing TB patients to sunlight. And he was able to cure the TB on the skin by sun exposure. He didn't understand the mechanism, but we now do. What I care about the most are pregnant women. And the reason is, it turns out that even infertility has been associated with vitamin D deficiency. But during pregnancy, pregnant women who are vitamin D deficient during their pregnancy have a marked increased risk of developing the most serious complication of pregnancy, preeclampsia. They have like a 60%, 40% increased risk of having premature birth. Their infant has a much higher risk of developing dental caries in his first primary teeth. They're more likely to have wheezing disorders as young children. So to me, it's very important for pregnant women to be aware of their vitamin D status and to take adequate vitamin D, which we'll talk about in a minute. Also, since you're an expert in muscle function is critically important for birthing. So we did a study at our hospital, and we asked a question. In over 250 women that were giving birth, either by C-section or vaginally, and we measured their blood level of 25-hydroxyvitamin D, and we showed that they had a marked reduced risk of requiring a C-section if they simply were vitamin D sufficient at the time that they gave birth. We also know that a study was done in Finland where they gave infants in Finland 2,000 units a day to prevent rickets. And then Dr. Hopponen looked at the data and followed the medical records of these children up to 31 years of age and found remarkably an 88% reduced risk of getting type 1 diabetes. Recently, there's what's called a VITAL study, where men and women over the age of 55 were given either placebo or 2,000 units of vitamin D a day. Originally, they concluded it had no benefit for cancer, no benefit for reducing risk of cardiovascular disease. They found out later on that that's actually not true. In fact, if you took 2,000 units a day, it reduced your risk of dying of cancer by 25%. But also they found that it reduces risk of autoimmune disorders by 22%, including psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, for example. We also know that your brain has a vitamin D receptor, and there's good evidence that vitamin D deficiency, a study was done in Australia, where they showed those individuals in a nursing home that had the lowest blood levels of 25-hydroxyvitamin D had a marked increased risk for depression and neurocognitive dysfunction. There's a lot of debate about whether or not vitamin D improves muscle function. But I can tell you, we've done a study and we showed very clearly that severe vitamin D deficiency causes muscle weakness, and proximal muscle weakness in particular. So your hips and your shoulders, for example. And so one way that you can tell, and we did a study at a nursing home in the Boston area, is to have elders get from a sitting to standing position. If they can't get up, right, then they have severe proximal muscle weakness in their hip girdle region, right? Or if it takes them a long time to get up, or they need to hold on to something to push themselves up, vitamin D deficiency could be a potential cause. And so it's important to recognize that.
The vitamin D receptor, the VDR, as you've said, is on every cell in the body. And is that why we see when levels aren't optimal, health conditions arise?
So this is what we think is going on, right? Is that vitamin, so we actually, I was just curious. And so I did a study and asked the question, when on earth did vitamin D make its first appearance? And it turns out, well over 500 million years ago, that the earliest life forms, phytoplankton, were making vitamin D. And we think throughout evolution that most organisms have the capacity to make vitamin D. And in fact, I've argued that as in a ocean environment, you have a high calcium environment. And so if you're a vertebrate fish, you can just simply suck that calcium out of the ocean and use it for your skeleton. But as organisms left the ocean onto terra firma, they were confronted with a problem, which was there was no calcium easily available, right? They would had to have a mechanism to efficiently absorb calcium from their diet, and vitamin D came into play. I also, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it's quite possible that it certainly could have helped in the demise of the dinosaurs, is that they were vertebrates, huge vertebrates. They would have needed a huge amount of calcium to maintain their skeletons, and that pall of smoke and the lack of any ultraviolet radiation exposure certainly could have helped in the demise of the dinosaur. And what's interesting is that people don't like to hear this, but it's true, is that we evolved, right, from the rodents that existed at that time. And rodents did not need vitamin D to survive. And even today, we know that a rodent can easily survive being vitamin D deficient. And of course, they mainly come out at night so that they don't really get sunlight, although they can get it from their diet.
Super interesting. When was vitamin D actually discovered?
So vitamin D was discovered back in, McCollum actually discovered it. And it had been known in the 1800s that cod liver oil could prevent rickets. In 1919, Holczynski, an Austrian physician, exposed children to a mercury arc lamp and demonstrated it could cure rickets. Hesset Unger in 2021 went ahead and showed that children exposed to sunlight on a roof of a New York City hospital in New York City, it could cure rickets. And so we knew that there was some anti-rickettic activity in cod liver oil. But what was it? The thinking was at the time it was vitamin A. However, McCollum at the University of Wisconsin cleverly took the cod liver oil and oxidized it and boiled it. It turns out that vitamin A is totally unstable to heat. And so when he did that, the cod liver oil still had anti-rickettic activity in his rodent models. And so as a result, he realized, there's a new vitamin in that cod liver oil. And so they had already discovered A, B, and C. So the next one on the list was vitamin D. So yeah, around 1924 is when...
1924.
Yeah.
And you'll often hear vitamin D being called a hormone. So how did it get this status, and what does that actually mean?
Right. So vitamin, as you probably know, is vital amine, because back then they didn't know the structures of these things. And so, and the fact that it was an accessory factor that you couldn't make theoretically is that was what was called a vitamin, right? But it turns out that vitamin D, of course, is made in your skin. So by definition, it's a hormone. Also, it has to go to your liver and to kidneys to get activated, and then the active form goes to your intestine, bone, and other tissues. And so as a result, by definition, it's a hormone.
And you've mentioned before that we produce, or Mother Nature found a way for producing vitamin D through sunlight. Are there other ways that we get benefit from either sunlight or vitamin D that are not a vitamin D receptor pathway?
By all means. I've written on this, biologic effects of sunlight. And so, for example, when you're exposed to sunlight, you make beta endorphin in your skin. And that's probably one of the reasons why you feel better. You release nitric oxide and also induce the production of nitric oxide, which causes vasodilation and makes you feel better, and your blood pressure goes down. Believe it or not, when your hemoglobin is exposed to sunlight, the UVA radiation is absorbed, and it releases carbon monoxide, right? So you would think it's a very toxic substance, but in very minute quantities, it acts as a vasodilator and a neurotransmitter. And so there are a multitude of biologic effects of sunlight that people should appreciate, which is why for the past 40 years I've been recommending sensible sun exposure.
And what does that actually mean? Because I think this is where there's mixed messages, especially in Australia, which is to slip, slop, slap, avoid sun exposure at all cost. And these days, many people are putting the highest SPF factor in their makeup before they step out of the house in the morning. I have a lot of questions around this. Can we produce vitamin D even if we're wearing sunscreen? And what does sensible sun exposure actually mean?
Yeah. So it turns out that if you're using the sunscreen properly, which I think is 2 milligrams per centimeter squared, SPF of 30, by definition, should absorb 97.5% of the UVB radiation, which is responsible for making vitamin D. And therefore, if you put on SPF 30 properly, you will reduce your ability to make vitamin D in your skin by 97.5%. SPF of 50 is basically 99%, right? And I have no problem with people using these very high SPFs because they never put it on properly in the first place. So they're probably getting more like an SPF of 20 or 30, which is perfectly fine because by definition, right, an SPF means that if you have SPF of 20, that means you could be outside 20 times longer before you would get a sunburn, right? And so what to do? And by the way, there was a study done in Australian dermatologists years ago, and they showed in the summertime, 87% of dermatologists were vitamin D deficient. And we also know from another study that 40% of Australians are vitamin D deficient. So what to do? I mean, it's just like anything else in life, right? Excess, yes, is going to increase risk for non-melanoma skin cancer. Sunburning experiences, having red hair, having bad genetics, having a large number of moles on your body increases risk of the most deadly form, melanoma, right? So what is sensible sun exposure? So what I typically recommend is you go out for about 50% of the time that would cause what's called a minimal erythemal dose, which means that you would get a slight pinkness to your skin 24 hours later, not a sunburn, and that it would quickly disappear, right? Well, that sounds great, and maybe people know their sensitivity, but the cloud cover, time of day, season of year, latitude, how are you going to know? And so working with ontometrics in California and with the data that we generated, because I sent out samples up to Norway, down to Buenos Aires, Florida, Los Angeles, to ask the question, what is the effect of time of day, season, latitude, degree of skin pigmentation? And make a long story short is that if your zenith angle is greater than 35 degrees, the sunlight UVB is being absorbed by the ozone layer. And as a result, you're making no vitamin D. So here in Boston in wintertime, from about November until next March, you won't make any vitamin D in your skin, no matter how long you stay outside. Skin pigmentation is a perfect sunscreen, so it reduces your ability to make vitamin D. Cloud cover can certainly absorb UVB radiation. So what to do? So working with Ontometrics, we developed an app called dminder.info. So dminder.info. And it will tell you in Australia or in India or in Europe or United States, just about anywhere on this planet, when you can make vitamin D, how much vitamin D you make, and it warns you to get out of the sun so you don't get a sunburn. And just to give you a couple of other examples, people think that if, say, you went to the equator, down to the Caribbean for a nice vacation, say in summertime or in the wintertime, and you get up in the morning at 7 o'clock in the morning, the sun is shining brightly, and you think, make a lot of vitamin D, less damaging to your skin. No. Turns out that we've done studies in India, United States, Panama, down in South America. You don't begin to make vitamin D in your skin until about 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, and it abruptly ends at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. because the zenith angle is changing. And so the early morning, it's much higher than 35 degrees, and at late afternoon, it's the same. And so it's only between about 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. that's the maximum benefit from being exposed to sunlight.
And does that correlate to a UVB index?
It is, but the problem is that the UVB index simply tells you that what the angle, right? Because that's how much UV is coming in. But you can't use that as a way of knowing how long you need to stay outside, because you don't have your skin related to the UV index, right? The higher the UV index, the shorter the time you could be outside. And that's why that app can be so beneficial.
And I've used that app. It's been very helpful.
Oh, good. And regarding your face, we recommend that you use the makeup on your face. And your face is only 4% of your body surface. It's the most sun exposed and the most likely to get non-melanoma skin cancer. And so I always recommend protecting face, typically with a hat, if at all possible, but sunscreen for sure. So sensible sun exposure means you go out for a period of time, use that app, and then put the sunscreen on, or preferably clothing, right? Because people are becoming more concerned these days about all these chemicals in the sunscreen, and people don't realize that those chemicals, they get absorbed into your skin, through your skin, into your circulation, go into your liver. So your liver is getting active to get rid of this stuff. And so my preference is, whenever possible, is to wear as much clothing as possible as your sun protection. Can I get back to one other comment?
Yeah.
Because I don't think I finished the story, which is, we know that the vitamin D is critically important for your blood calcium. And so it turns out that the body takes priority for that. But once you've satisfied that requirement, now the 25-hydroxyvitamin D at higher concentrations can go to your colon, breast, brain, and they get activated locally. And as a result, will regulate cellular growth, reduce risk for cancer, alter your immune system in a positive way, reducing risk for autoimmune disorders, and the list goes on. Your immune cells are very responsive to vitamin D, to active vitamin D. Your macrophages, which are those cells that gobble up your viruses and infectious agents like bacteria, they activate vitamin D. And they send out that activated vitamin D to lymphocytes and control their activity and control cytokine production. And we think that that's one of the reasons why we and others have reported during the COVID pandemic that the cytokine storm, which was killing people, that if you were vitamin D sufficient, you were less likely to die because your vitamin D was regulating and controlling cytokine storm activity.
I'd like to talk in a few moments about what kind of numbers we should be looking at. But before we do, there still are many people who are scared of sunlight. I think primarily for skin aging, full stop. And they won't be convinced otherwise. Is the vitamin D we get from supplement and food the same vitamin D that we get from sunlight? Do they need to worry, in other words?
Yeah. And so we think that for the most part, the vitamin D that you make from sun exposure is the same as the vitamin D that you're ingesting. But there are other photoproducts being made, and we and Dr. Slominski and others have been showing that they may have anti-cancer effects and maybe some other benefits as well. So it continues to be a good question that needs to be answered. We've tried to get funding from NIH asking that question, but people have felt that it was not a significant question to answer. So we've not been able to get funding for it.
Then let's turn our attention to what optimal levels of D are. And for any of the public who's tried to get an answer by looking online, there'll be a variety of numbers from the Institute of Medicine to the Endocrine Society to other experts, and that can vary, at least in Australia, from 50 nanomoles to north of 100 nanomoles, which correspond with equatorial tribes or Australian surf lifesavers. Where do you sit? Because you've seen this controversy come and go in terms of numbers, but in Australia, for a bit of backstory, it's now recommended that doctors don't test for vitamin D, and there isn't a recommended number you should be targeting. So let's dive into this one.
So in 2010, the Institute of Medicine came out with its recommendations, and depending upon who's listening, the bottom line was that they considered vitamin D sufficiency 15 nanomoles, which is 20 nanograms per ml and above. In 2011, the Endocrine Society practice guidelines came out. I chaired that committee. All the members on that committee were experts in the field of vitamin D. We carefully reviewed the literature, and we concluded that vitamin D deficiency is less than 15 nanomoles per liter, 20 nanograms per ml. But you're insufficient for maximum bone health between 21 and 29 nanograms per ml, or 51 to 74 nanomoles per liter. Now, why did we do that? Because there was a study done by Primmel. He's a German pathologist. And what he did was to take unfortunate adults, ages 20 to 90, who died in an accident. And he got their blood and their bone. And he measured the blood level of 25-hydroxy-D, and then took and looked carefully at the histology of the bone to see for evidence of vitamin D deficiency osteomalacia. And he concluded that in order to be vitamin D sufficient and have no evidence for vitamin D bone disease, you needed to be at least 30 nanograms or 75 nanomoles per liter. And as a result, that was the recommendation that we made. Because of the variability of the assay, we decided that the preferred range should be 40 to 60 nanograms per ml, which is 100 to 150 nanomoles per liter. Up to 100 nanograms per ml is perfectly fine, which is 250 nanomoles per liter. You only begin to see toxicity when it's over 150 nanograms per ml, 375 nanomoles per liter. And so from 2011 until 2024, for the most part, the world kind of accepted it. Health agencies did not, because from my perspective, if they really believed that you needed to be 30 nanograms per ml or 75 nanomoles per liter, most of their populations would be deficient, and they would need to do something about that. But in 2024, the Endocrine Society came out with their guidelines. But they make it clear, which is really curious, is that their goal for their recommendations had nothing to do with the definition of vitamin D deficiency, or the treatment of vitamin D deficiency, or the prevention of vitamin D deficiency. No, their goal was to look at all the literature and to ask the question, how much vitamin D do you need for health benefits? They also concluded that most of the world's population is vitamin D sufficient, and therefore you don't need to measure their vitamin D status. They never took into account obesity, by the way, which we'll talk about in a minute. And so what's interesting, when you read the report, they concluded, and they agreed that the literature says, pregnant women who had a marked increased intake of vitamin D, reduced risk of preeclampsia, premature births, etc. Right? They agreed that prediabetes, those that took 4,000 units a day, could reduce risk of developing diabetes. But again, they concluded most of the population is sufficient, you don't have to worry. And so in the end, the recommendation was identical to the Institute of Medicine with one exception. right? So the IOM recommended back in 2010, infants up to 1 year of age, 400 units. Children and adults, 600 units a day. And if you're 75 and older, 800 units a day. In 2024, the Endocrine Society came out and said, to improve mortality, you should be on 900 units a day if you're 75 years and older. So I wrote a review on this and pointed out to them, A, you don't die and begin dying at the age of 75, right? It's chronic illnesses beforehand that ultimately will cause increased mortality risk. So taking 100 more units of vitamin D seems to be nonsensical. And I also pointed out that if you believe that this vitamin D reduces risk of all of these complications in pregnancy or advancing from pre-diabetes to diabetes, why didn't you make those recommendations? But they did not do that, which was really a disappointment. The Endocrine Society in 2011 recommended infants 400 to 600 units a day. Right, and I had recommended to the committee, they had agreed. Just to pick a number doesn't make any sense, right? A range seems to be more reasonable because a person, first of all, if you get a supplement, it doesn't contain what it says on the label. It has more in it. Otherwise, it wouldn't maintain shelf life, right? So we said 400 to 600 units a day for infants. 600 to 1,000 for children up to 18 years of age. 1,500 to 2,000 for all adults. And if you're obese, you need 2 to 3 times more because the vitamin D is fat soluble and it gets incorporated into your body fat. And a lot of the medical community and the healthcare professionals took that information very seriously, and I think it really improved the vitamin D status of the world's population as a result.
You've been studying vitamin D for 60 years. What do you think the range should be for vitamin D?
Just like you had said, right? To me, if we could tell what our hunter-gatherers were making, that's probably telling us the level we should have. And as that study in Africa, they showed that Maasai herders and Hadza, who are the true bush men and women, right? Their levels are 40 to 60 nanograms per ml or 100 to 150 nanomoles per liter. But another insight that I think is really important is that your listeners may not be aware, there's essentially no vitamin D in human breast milk. And as a result, you have to give your infant vitamin D supplementation as soon as possible. Now, if you think about this from an evolutionary perspective, this makes no sense. And so, in fact, the study was done by Hollis and Wagner years ago, showed 6,400 units a day to lactating women, raising their blood level in the range of 40 to 60 nanograms per ml, put enough vitamin D in their milk to satisfy their infant's requirement. So from my perspective, I think, and I'd recommend it for all of my patients, we want the range of 40 to 60 up to 100 is perfectly safe. I personally take 7,000 units every day. My blood level is 82 nanograms per ml.
Based on that, my 3 children, when they were infants, received vitamin D. Also, based on your work, I naturally, via sunlight, keep mine at 150 nanomoles without taking supplementation. So your work is so vast across so many different systems and reviews. I would like to turn our attention to bone health and vitamin D, especially post-menopause, and then looking at the extraskeletal benefits of vitamin D as well. And in particular, some of the more controversial areas of megadosing for autoimmune disease or the common cold or COVID. There's new excitement or enthusiasm around megadosing. So I'd like to talk about the pluses and minuses and things we need to be careful of. But just before we tackle postmenopause and bone, is the only way we can know our vitamin D status via a blood test? And what are the different options? You'll sometimes see 25 hydroxy vitamin D. You'll sometimes see 125. How do we know we're getting the right test? Or what's the differences between labs, between immunoassays and mass spec?
Yeah. So you only want to measure 25 hydroxy vitamin D. The active form of vitamin D circulates at 1,000 times less concentration. And believe it or not, when you're vitamin D deficient, your 125 dihydroxy vitamin D levels can actually be elevated, right? And the reason being that you still have enough substrate of 25 hydroxy D when you're deficient to get the kidneys to activate more, because the body recognizes that you're vitamin D deficient. And so your parathyroid hormone level goes up. It tells your kidneys to activate more vitamin D, and your intestine has a deficiency of 125 dihydroxy vitamin D. The function of vitamin D for bone health is clear. It's to maintain your blood calcium and phosphate in a normal range. For in utero and for infants, it regulates chondrocyte maturation, which is very important as the bones are growing. And so for children, critically important for maximizing the amount of calcium and phosphate going into the bone, which is calcium hydroxyapatite, mineralizing your bone, and prevents rickets, which is where you don't get adequate mineralization, and as a result, you wind up, can have bowed legs, for example, because of gravity pushing down on these young children. For adults, what vitamin D does is help to maintain your bone mineral density, right? Once you've closed your epiphyseal plates and you reach maturity, you reach your peak bone mass at around age 25. And so I tell my patients, look, that you want to make sure you have adequate calcium intake. 1,000 milligrams a day, in my opinion, is ideal, preferably from food sources. Dairy, in my opinion, is ideal also, because it also contains whey protein, which is a superb source of protein that has all the essential amino acids. And adequate vitamin D. If you're vitamin D deficient, you can't mineralize the newly laid down collagen matrix. This is problematic for a couple of reasons. First is it destabilizes your skeletal architecture. Number two is that it can expand like jello in your bone, and as a result, when it gets hydrated, is that you feel throbbing, aching bone pain. And so a lot of people, especially in the wintertime, feel tired and have throbbing, aching bone pain, and they think they're working too hard, it's cold outside. No, it's osteomalacia, which is adult rickets. What vitamin D will not do, and I wrote a review on this recently, is it cannot make new collagen and mineralize that collagen. It cannot make new bone. The function of vitamin D is to maintain your bone, right? Because your bone is constantly turning over. And so it's constantly making sure you have enough calcium and phosphate to mineralize newly laid down matrix so that you maintain your bone density. And that's why I agree. You cannot use vitamin D to treat osteoporosis. You want to prevent bone loss from vitamin D deficiency, which can progress to low bone mass, osteopenia, and osteoporosis.
What are your recommendations then for postmenopausal bone?
So my recommendation for postmenopausal bone health, I tell all my patients, walking 3 to 5 miles a week at least, because it's the pounding on the pavement that is important for maintaining both hip and spine bone density, adequate calcium intake, and adequate vitamin D intake to maintain what you have. But if you have osteoporosis and you need a bone active drug, make sure you're also getting adequate calcium and adequate vitamin D.
And does vitamin D recommendations change post-menopause?
No. Nope. And because what's interesting about vitamin D is that when you take a certain amount of vitamin D, you raise your blood level to a certain degree. We know from work that I did with Bob Heaney many years ago that for every 100 units you ingest, after you're above 50 nanomoles per liter, you will raise your blood level by about 0.2 to 2.5 nanomoles per liter for every 100 units you ingest. And so typically on 5,000 units a day, which is typically what I recommend for my patients, their levels are in the range of 40 to 60 nanograms per ml. And so to me, I think that that's a good range to be in. It's good for your bone health, but more importantly, it provides now the vitamin D for all of these extra calcium benefits, as we've talked about, reducing risk of preeclampsia, cesarean sectioning, premature births, autoimmune disorders, common cancers like breast cancer, reduce risk of breast cancer by as much as 50% if your 25-hydroxy-D is above 150 nanomoles per liter.
So why do you think, because the media loves a controversial story, whenever there is a non-positive finding about a vitamin D trial and pick your health marker they're looking at, why do we sometimes see underwhelming health response to vitamin D studies?
So part of the problem is the design of the study and this concept that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard. Well, that's true if you do it correctly, right? But the VITAL study, for example, right, what they did was they simply sent out 2,000 units of vitamin D, or they told the people that were on placebo or on 2,000 units a day, you could take up to 800 units a day. So that means that the placebo group could be on 800 units a day and the treatment group 2,000 units a day. Whether it's going to be a big difference or not, hard to know. But what's really remarkable, more than 50% of the subjects in that study were vitamin D sufficient, a 25-hydroxy-D of at least 75 nanomoles per liter, 30 nanograms per ml. So if you're vitamin D sufficient and taking vitamin D, why do you think you're going to see an additional benefit? Right? That's the problem. And unfortunately, all association studies, they say, well, they're just not gold level studies. And so we have to ignore them. And that's what the 2024 Guideline Committee did. And I pointed out in a review, look at those. I think that they're very important. And I also point out that, association studies have always been beneficial in giving us insight into beneficial effects. A good example being poor Dr. Semmelweis back in 1840s when he realized if you washed your hands with chlorine water, that you could preserve the life of a pregnant woman giving birth and the infant being born. And of course, at the time, the concept was you had bad humors in the air, so how would washing your hands help? And so he ultimately was considered crazy. His mentors committed him to an insane asylum. They beat him up on the way, and he died 2 months later of infectious disease. That's what happens when you challenge the system. And when it's obvious, and he even did an association study and proved it, it didn't make any difference.
Yeah. You've mentioned 5,000 IUs a day that you give to your patients of vitamin D. Should that be taken once a day? Should it be taken all in one go, once a week, once a month? You do see various recommendations.
Right. So in the United States, we started this back in 1998. We published this in Lancet, where we gave 50,000 units once a week for 8 weeks to fill up the empty tank. And then I put patients on 50,000 units every 2 weeks forever. Now, why did I do that? The reason is that this is the only pharmaceutical form available in the United States. Right? In India, for example, they have a 60,000 unit, what's called sachet, that they give to their patients. And elders, they don't want to remember to take it every day, right? They may forget. But what's interesting about vitamin D is very forgiving. And so I tell my patients, look, If you take 5,000 units a day, it's perfectly fine. But if you forget one day, you could take 10,000 the next. If you forget 7 days, you could take 70,000 units. Your blood level will go almost to the same degree. So it doesn't matter, right? Whether or not taking it daily has additional benefit, we don't know. But there's an interesting study that was done where they looked at epithelial membrane stabilization, a company out in Utah, and they did a study and they evaluated thousands of compounds thinking that they could find one, because if you could stabilize your endothelium membrane, reduces risk for inflammation, cardiovascular disease. And what did they find? Disappointing to them, but great for us. Vitamin D was the most effective in stabilizing endothelial membranes, thereby reducing risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, for example.
Have you ever seen any sex differences in vitamin D metabolism or requirements?
Simple.
And let's jump on to our final question, which is the role of megadoses, which has risen into popularity. There's a number of protocols by various doctors or potentially various charlatans that are recommending not 5,000 IUs, but more like 500,000 IUs daily to treat autoimmune disorders. I think in doing so, the risk of going toxic and having calcium-related issues is well established. But what's the rationale for extraskeletal benefits, autoimmune, cardiovascular disease, COVID, of taking these huge doses of vitamin D?
Right. I mean, there's a study in France at the beginning of COVID where they were giving like 200,000 units of vitamin D. It's perfectly fine to take one dose to quickly maybe raise your blood level, but you can't take these extremely high doses because, like you said, it'll cause toxicity. However, Dr. Coimbra down in Brazil had started a program well over a decade ago where he was taking patients with multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, and giving massive doses, basically 1,000 units per kilogram body weight, and demonstrating. I visited with him, I visited with his patients, and remarkably had dramatic effect. But the only way you can succeed is you have to be on a zero calcium diet. Because if you're not, you're going to increase your blood calcium. We just published a study of a young man that showed up in my office, and he had visual disturbance. They did an MRI, and he had what they thought was the beginning of multiple sclerosis. He did not want to be on a multiple sclerosis drug, even though I advised him to do so. He wanted to be on super high dose vitamin D and asked, would I do that and would I follow him? And I agreed to do that. And I had him on 50,000 to 55,000 units of vitamin D a day. I published him 4 years later. He's had no advancement. In fact, it's resolved, the lesion that was in his brain. So there is something to it. There's a doctor in India that's done the same thing, following the Coimbra protocol and finding very effective for psoriasis and for other autoimmune disorders. So there is something to it, but you have to be super carefully followed by somebody that knows what they're doing.
I've got 2 clients on the Coimbra protocol who have had remission of their autoimmune disorder. So I was very curious to get your viewpoint. What blood markers, in addition to being on a low calcium diet, would you need to be looking at? Because the reality is many people will do a very high vitamin D intake for whatever reason and would have no idea what's happening to their levels or the issues with calcium. So what would you be looking for in a blood panel to make sure that things are staying where they should be?
Well, the first thing to do is to get your blood calcium. And the first indication that your blood calcium is going up, just like in diabetes, is that you become more thirsty and you have polyuria, which is you're urinating much more frequently because the body is trying to get rid of the calcium. And so that's the first indication. It's your blood calcium you care about. and then parathyroid hormone, because it will be suppressed when your vitamin D toxic. It does decrease with the Coimbra protocol, but not to zero. It's still functional. But we do know, and we expected it, right, is that many of these people on these high doses, they're relatively young. They don't have osteoporosis. And so the body needs calcium. And so definitely what happens is when you have no calcium in your diet, you start taking it out of your skeleton. And so the bone density will go down by 1 to 2 or 3% over a couple of years. But that's a small price to pay compared to the consequence of the autoimmune disorder. So calcium is the most important, parathyroid hormone, and then bone remodeling markers are helpful.
Very interesting. Thank you. And is all vitamin D the same if you go to Walmart or iHerb or Amazon and you see vitamin D? Are we looking for vitamin D3, vitamin D2? How do we know we're getting what we're getting in the bottle?
Yeah. So vegans want vitamin D2 because vitamin D3 comes from cholesterol, which is obtained from the oil of sheep's wool, which is vitamin D3, which is, of course, what you make in your skin. We did a study and showed vitamin D2 and vitamin D3 at physiologic doses are equally effective in raising blood levels. So that's not an issue. And we also have evaluated vitamin D in nationally known brands. And the vitamin D content, there's about 20 to up to 50% more for shelf life. So it's not a problem. But be wary of internet. There was a company that didn't know the difference between microgram and milligram. And as a result, they still have on the market, even though I alerted the FDA and I alerted the company that you can't be doing this, but they have 1,000 milligrams in a capsule of vitamin D. And so you have to be very careful. I would always get a national brand just to be on the safe side.
Yeah, I had a client many years ago who self-prescribed vitamin D at very high levels and got the excessive amount by accident and ended up in hospital with calcium issues.
Yep, yeah. And a very famous, which will go unnamed, although we published him, nutrition guru. They, unfortunately, whoever was doing it didn't know the difference between microgram and milligram. So he even took it. And he was taking milligram quantity. He became a toxic. And all of his clients became toxic. And we published him. And they finally realized the problem.
Yeah, I remember that. Let's wrap up with you. What do you do for your health, your vitamin D? You've had some health challenges. Let's wrap up by hearing what somebody who studied vitamin D and is an endocrinologist their entire life. What are you doing for your health and well-being?
Well, I personally take 7,000 units of vitamin D a day. I drink 3 glasses of skim milk every day to get my calcium and my whey protein. I've markedly increased my protein intake by having a protein shake, which is mainly whey protein, and having some of these bars that have minimum sugar but have a good amount of protein and fiber. I have stage 3 prostate cancer. I have had no testosterone for 2 years. I refused to let that get me down. And so I started training, as I said, for the Boston Marathon and ran it in 2024 and 2025. I'm trying to train now to run the Boston Marathon again next year for my 80th birthday. And so I think having a good, healthy diet, adequate vitamin D intake, some sensible sun exposure, and good exercise program, and having, in my case, I've been married 53 plus years, a very stable environment is all very helpful in minimizing aging effects.
Did you know in the 1960s you would spend the rest of your life studying vitamin D?
Not at all. I mean, basically, it's a whole different story. But I don't know if you read the review I wrote on the 100th anniversary, right? I was considered to be inconsequential, and that I would never do anything of any consequence. And I happened to be in the right place at the right time, and God-given gift, and it's been, yeah, for me, amazing journey that I've continued to enjoy.
link that paper. You actually sent me that paper. You probably don't remember, but I couldn't find it, and you kindly sent it to me to read. But I'll make sure that's a great paper. I will put that out there. What's next for you? You're almost 80. You're still working. You're as prolific as ever. You've got over 600 PubMed publications on vitamin D. Is there another book or a revision of the vitamin D solution in the pipeline?
So I'm going to be editing with my co-editor, Jerry Neves, a book on nutrition and bone health that'll be coming out probably next year. But I now have a whole new area of interest called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I've now been helping hundreds of families falsely accused of child abuse. Super controversial. I mean, it's nothing that this area of controversial activity is nothing compared to the vitamin D story. The pediatricians are unteachable, and you bring an infant in with fractures, and if they don't have a genetic positive test for osteogenesis imperfecta, then they're diagnosed as being a child abuser. And in my opinion, this is now the Salem witch trials 2021. I mean, it's incomprehensible, and I've been heavily involved. In fact, to the point where I testified against our pediatricians at my hospital, and my hospital terminated me.
Wow. Oh, well, you're not shy of fighting a good battle and steering away from controversy. I will watch that with keen interest. And I want to just reiterate and give my huge thanks for donating your time today, but for 60 years of exceptional work in the field of vitamin D and endocrinology and bone. So much of our understanding about vitamin D, full stop, has come from you and your colleagues. So I wish you all the best for your future endeavors. And thank you again for giving up your time today.
My pleasure. Have a delightful day.
Thank you, Dr. Holick. Thanks for tuning into the Stronger with Time podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing or sharing it with someone who would benefit from hearing this. And if you're ready to go deeper, the 9-week Science of Thriving course is available now. The link is in the show notes.